All right, let's dive right into this explainer. I want you to imagine traveling back roughly 2,500 years to an ancient world where humanity was literally navigating its way through life using epic poems, legends, and, well, tales of terrifying sea monsters. Just picture a world where hard science wasn't your guide at all, storytelling was.
So that brings us to a rather fascinating question. How do you actually map a world made of myths? I mean, just imagine trying to plan a crucial, high-stakes merchant trade route across the incredibly dangerous Mediterranean Sea. But your only reference point is some localized legend about an angry sea god, or a fabled monster living just past the horizon. It's not exactly a great business strategy, right?
And you know, this brilliantly highlights the massive intellectual gap we're looking at today. On one side, you have a world governed almost entirely by poetic imagination and blind tradition, and on the other, the stark contrast of a revolutionary new idea, organized, rational inquiry. Today, we're going to unpack this incredible shift from storytelling to hard evidence and the guy who boldly led that charge.
Now, the catalyst for this revolution wasn't some sudden magical epiphany. It was a physical place called Miletus. Located right on the western coast of Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey, Miletus was basically the information superhighway of the ancient world. It was this buzzing, incredibly wealthy intellectual and trading hub. Think about the massive flow of data happening here. You had merchants constantly arriving from Egypt, Persia, Phoenicia, Scythia, the Black Sea, and they were bringing hard, real-world facts with them. It was literally the perfect incubator for early rational thinkers, like Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, who finally started looking for logical answers instead of mythical ones.
Enter our unsung hero, Hecataeus. He was an aristocrat born right into the middle of this intellectual hotspot. And what makes him so vital to our history is that he used his immense wealth and resources not just to, live comfortably, but to obsessively collect facts. He was the guy down at the docks talking to the sailors, studying foreign cultures, and actively deciding to turn all that mythological storytelling into an organized observational science.
What's really wild about his timeline, starting with his birth around 550 BCE, is that he wasn't just some philosopher locked away in a tower reading old scrolls. He was out there. He traveled widely through Egypt, Persia, and the Mediterranean. And during the Ionian revolt against the massive Persian Empire, he actually stepped up as a pragmatic political advisor. He urged caution because he truly understood Persian military might, and later he even tried to negotiate peace. He deeply grasped real-world power and geography in a very practical sense, right up until his death around 476 BCE.
So how did he actually pull this off? Well, he was essentially building, scratch that. It's more like he was crowdsourcing the very first Google map, all by hand. This meant extensive personal travel and first-hand observation. He was aggressively interrogating merchants for detailed regional reports and utilizing his political contacts within the vast Persian Empire to gather intelligence. He combined all of this by rigorously analyzing earlier primitive maps and records. The man was actively hunting for evidence.
But here's where it gets really interesting. A massive turning point in his life happened during his travels to Egypt in what I love to call the Egyptian reality check. So according to the historian Herodotus, Hecataeus proudly boasted to some Egyptian priests about his divine, mythological Greek ancestry. The priests' response? They just quietly countered by showing him these meticulously kept, completely non-mythical written records that spanned countless human generations. They basically fact-checked him in real time, directly challenging his Greek myths with actual historical records. And that sparked a deep, irreversible skepticism of blind tradition in him. That new skepticism totally drove his monumental output. Now, only fragments of his writing survive today, but we do know of two major works. First, the Ges Periodos, or Journey Around the Earth, which focused on a systematic description of the known world, structured by Europe and Asia, and really prioritized literal coastlines and trade. The second was the Genealogiae, where he took that same rational, skeptical analysis and applied it to Greek myths and ancestry. He was basically trying to systematically categorize both the physical Earth and the history of its people.
Let's zoom in on his geographical masterpiece for a second, the Ges Periodos. This was revolutionary, primarily because it totally ignored the gods and instead gave people a structured, predictable world. He divided the Earth logically into Europe and Asia, with Asia actually including Egypt, Persia, and the parts of Africa known to the Greeks at the time. He meticulously detailed actual coastlines, rivers, native peoples, and cities. And most importantly, his writing followed the practical routes that were actually being used by sailors. He was giving traders an ordered, highly practical picture of borders and trade routes for the very first time. Okay, if you remember literally only one thing from this entire explainer, it needs to be this quote from his Genealogia: "I write what I believe to be true, for the stories of the Greeks are many and ridiculous." Think about that for a second. This is the ultimate mic drop moment of antiquity. He is openly, explicitly rejecting the deeply cherished myths of his own culture in favor of evidence-based truth. And that exact flavor of skepticism, that officially birthed what we call rational geography. This was the crucial transition of geographical study away from mythological storytelling and imaginary monsters toward an observation-based, human-centered science. He drew a hard line in the sand right then and there, forever separating the practical mapping of real human beings from the poetic mapping of imaginary realms.
Because of this new rational, evidence-first approach, Hecataeus significantly improved the map of the world. He built upon earlier, much cruder maps created by Anaximander. Now, yes, he still incorrectly depicted the Earth as a circular, flat disk surrounded by an endless ocean, which was just a reflection of his time. But the massive upgrade was that he actively erased mythical lands from the map in favor of real peoples, drastically increasing the accuracy of coastal and regional descriptions based purely on hard travel data.
And honestly, this shows how wide his impact really was. I kind of think of him as the accidental anthropologist. Because he was so fiercely committed to mapping real people, he meticulously documented the customs, the clothing, the social behaviors, and the political organizations of the different peoples he or his sources encountered. By actually caring about the real, everyday details of different cultures, he didn't just map the physical dirt and water, he literally laid the groundwork for ethnography and anthropology.
Which brings us to a really fun historical debate, the father face-off. History very often gives a later scholar, Eratosthenes, the official title, Father of Geography. And fair enough, right? Eratosthenes coined the term, he used advanced math, and he scientifically calculated the Earth's circumference. But look at Hecataeus, the pioneer. He was the early organizer who collected the raw data, bravely removed the myths, and mapped the regions first. Eratosthenes was the scientific founder, absolutely, but he was building his scientific house entirely on the rational foundation that Hecataeus had poured centuries earlier.
Now, to be completely fair, we definitely have to acknowledge the limitations of the 6th century BCE. Hecataeus fundamentally misunderstood the shape of the Earth. His distance calculations were, frankly, highly inaccurate, his knowledge of deeper Africa and Asia was super limited, and he obviously had to rely way too heavily on second-hand merchant reports. But, and this is an absolutely vital distinction, these were limitations of his era's technological tools, not of his intellectual method. Given the sheer constraints of living in 500 BCE, his achievements were absolutely staggering.
When you zoom out, what we are really looking at here is a monumental paradigm shift. Hecataeus represents one of the single greatest turning points in human thought. Step 1, the move from myth to reason. Step 2, the transition from legend to first-hand observation. And Step 3, the leap from poetic imagination to organized inquiry. He transformed our entire worldview, step by step, from fantasy to logical organization.
Which brings us to our final thought to wrap up this explainer. I want you to ask yourself, every time you open a map app on your phone today, are you relying on the legacy of a man who dared to call myths ridiculous 2,500 years ago? Just think about how much of our modern, organized, beautifully data-driven world still relies on that initial, incredibly brave leap from comfortable legend to rigorous observation. Next time you check your GPS, maybe give a little nod to Hecataeus. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep seeking the facts.